So I will, this is actually Claudia, thank you for the reminder.
Thank you.
I'll do questions at the end of this. So if people want to use the chat to put in questions as I'm going, at the end, I'll go through that and answer everyone's questions. And I'll be talking, this is a fairly informal book talk about kind of how I got the idea for Fast Girls and what my process was like and what I learned. And so as I said, at the end, I'll take some questions and I'll just be giving kind of an overview. I've checked out a bunch of the other talks that have come, and some of those have gone more in depth into, Title IX and Helen specifically and the Olympics. So I definitely recommend viewers, if you haven't already, to please check out those other programs. They're really fascinating. And so, yeah, so without further ado, I'll get going. And I'm going to share my screen with you because I do have a bunch of pictures and things to share with you all. So Fast Girls is a novel about 3 trailblazing women Olympians of the 20s and 30s. And the idea for this book, okay, so, well, my first slide is all 3 of my main characters. So that's Betty Robinson on the left, and I'm gonna go into each of these women in more depth. Louise Stokes in the middle, and Helen Stevens, who is probably best known to all of you, there on the far right. So I have had years of wanting to be an Olympian myself. As a girl, I figure skated till I was about 13. And Peggy Fleming was really my original inspiration. I first saw her in Boston at the Ice Capades as a young girl and knew I wanted to become a figure skater. And so Boston has a long history of Olympians. So I, at one point, wrote fan mail to Kitty and Peter Carruthers, who were pair skaters. And over the years, Boston, people would come to Boston for various sporting events. And I also always watched the Boston Marathon. That was a big part of my growing up. My family, we had a stop in Wellesley where we'd always go and watch it. And so I was a huge fan of Joan Benoit, who was the first woman to win the first Olympic marathon in 1984 in Los Angeles. I have a very clear memory of watching that with my grandfather, actually. And, I had seen her at that point run the Boston Marathon several times. So that was really fun to see a local girl win. But there I am as I include this sort of funny picture of me as a kid there on the right in my chartreuse colored skating outfit that was meant to, of course, harken back to Peggy Fleming, my real hero. But, so all these years I played sports my whole life. I figure skated, and then I ended up playing field hockey. I ran track all through school. I eventually did run the Boston Marathon myself. I still play competitive league USTA tennis. And so it was kind of funny when a few years ago, the idea for this novel was born when my younger daughter, who is there on the left, she is a swimmer. And she was probably in about 3rd or 4th grade there. She's got "Eat My Bubbles" written on her back in Sharpie. That was before a summer meet. She swims year round now, including outdoors right now because of COVID. It's pretty crazy since it is in the 40s here. But she had to do a biography project for a library class, and she had to pick a famous American on which to do her project. So she picked Gertrude Ederle. Now, Ederle was someone I had never heard of, I'm embarrassed to admit. But it turns out she was an Olympic swimmer. She won 3 medals in the Paris Games in 1924. And for most of us, that would be enough. We would be done with 3 medals. But she was just getting started. And she became the first woman to swim the English Channel. It took her 2 tries and about 14 and a half hours, but she did it. And that photo there of her is, she's in France about to get started. She's covered in lard. That was part of what she wore to kind of stay warm and to stave off stings and things. And you can see those goggles she made. They were motorcycle goggles, but she was a real pioneer in women's athletics. And in fact, when she returned home to the United States, President Wilson called her America's best girl. She had a ticker tape parade for her thrown in Manhattan, and she was a big deal. She was a celebrity to rival Amelia Earhart. And yet here I was I think this was 2017, helping my daughter with a school project on her, and I had never heard of Ederle. And it really got me to thinking about other women Olympians and just women athletes in general, because much of what I knew about women's athletics really came from athletes like Billie Jean King and Kathrine Switzer of the Boston Marathon, women who were much more recent, really. And so I realized there was this whole history of women who came before, who really paved the way even for athletes like Benoit and Switzer and Fleming and Hamill and all these other great athletes who we can probably fairly easily list off the top of our heads. There was a whole generation of women who have largely been forgotten, I think. And so I wanted to dig in there and get to know these women better. And so I first started casting around. And here is a photo down on the bottom right of Baron Pierre de Coubertin, who is the father of the modern Olympics. He had this idea of kind of uniting the globe through athletic. And yet he had no interest in half of the globe participating. He thought the only role for women should be to crown the victor. And so you can see that quote of his right there. No matter how toughened a sportswoman may be, her organism is not cut out to sustain certain shocks. He, as I said, didn't want women to compete in any form. He thought they were lesser athletes and there was really no purpose for them. And yet, under some pressure, so the first modern Olympics, I should say, was in 1896 in Athens. And then the following Olympics was in 1900, so 4 years later in Paris. And it was really a sideshow of the exposition that was happening, the World Exposition. And there was a golf tournament that this American woman, Margaret Abbott, entered as a golfer. And she ended up coming in first, and they gave her a porcelain bowl, and she went about her life. She was an art student studying in Paris. Her mother actually even competed with her in this tournament. But when she won her first place and her porcelain bowl, she kind of went back to her art studies, eventually came home to the United States. And when she passed away in the 1950s, she had no idea that she had been competing in the Olympics, actually. That golf tournament wasn't just a regular run-of-the-mill golf tournament, it was an Olympic event. And so by winning first place, she was actually the first American woman to win a gold medal. And yet she never knew it. Her family never knew it. The historian who uncovered all of this notified her family and her family was delighted and just sorry that Margaret never knew of her accomplishment. And the other thing I'd like to point out is because Margaret's mother also competed in this games, it makes them the only mother-daughter duo to have ever competed in the Olympics together. So some little known history. And the reason I point that out is I think it really just illustrates much of kind of this early participation by women in the Olympics. They were really a sideshow. No one was really paying attention to them. And that will continue for many, many games to come. But really, more and more women were trying to put pressure on the International Olympic Committee, the IOC, to participate in the Olympics. And we can kind of see this range of photographs that gives us an idea of what early women Olympians, what kinds of events they were competing in. The woman there on the far left-hand corner, in quite the getup, I mean, it's hard to picture that as an athletic number. I don't think that was her athletic costume. She ended up being the first woman to win a gold medal. She was a sailor, and she crewed a boat with her husband and several others. Archery, fencing, diving, tennis, and swimming were some early events. And then there's this woman in the middle there who's rowing, and her name was Alice Milliot. Well, Alice was a woman who was putting pressure on the IOC to add more Olympic events. Specifically, she was really interested in gymnastics and women's track and field being added. But the IOC felt that those were not feminine enough. They were interested in what they called aesthetically pleasing events. And so they kept putting her off. And so she did what I think many of us love about a tenacious woman. She decided to throw her own Olympics. And she was no fool. She knew where she was going to do this. She went to Monte Carlo, and she threw several very successful women's only Olympics, much to the chagrin, I should add, to the IOC. In fact, they were mad she was using the word Olympics in her event. They were quite jealous of the attention she was getting. So eventually, under pressure, the IOC agrees to allow women to compete in track and field on a provisional basis. And this is where we meet the first of my three main characters in Fast Girls, Betty Robinson, in 1928. This was the event, the Olympics in Amsterdam, that the IOC decided to allow 5 events, several running, several track and field. And so Betty was this schoolgirl out of Chicago who one day was running for the train, and a teacher noticed her and thought she looked fast. And so a few days later, he threw a time trial for her, and lo and behold, she was fast. And so he recommended that she try out, she compete in a local event, a local race. And this is interesting because women actually had been, or girls, and women had been banned from competing in track and field events in Illinois in about 1907 or 1908, sort of depending on when the law actually took effect. And so Betty becomes not only a trailblazer when it comes to the Olympics in track and field, but also just for women's participation, girls' participation in high school athletics, because she is a sort of a part of that law changing in Illinois. And so I find this just amazing, but her parents put her on this ship bound for Amsterdam as a 16-year-old. Now, I have a 15-year-old daughter, and I can't imagine doing that, but that's what they did at that time. And so Betty got on this ship surrounded by other athletes. And for 10 days, they traveled across the Atlantic to, they had a few chaperones, the girls did, the male athletes, no one talked about chaperones for them, but the women had some chaperones, and there were some young ones. Betty was not the only teenager. There were several others, including a diver and swimmer. So she was considered a real underdog. She had really no experience. When she showed up in Amsterdam, she'd only run in a handful of races. I mean, I think her first race in Amsterdam was maybe her 5th race overall. But she was successful when she had raced in Illinois, so successful she had been invited to the Olympic trials they weren't in Providence, they were in New Jersey at that point. And so she gets this invitation and off she goes. And no one had very high expectations for her, yet she proved to be a real underdog, and she won a gold medal in the 100. And then she won a silver in the relay. And so she ends up actually really kind of turning the perception around for these women in these Olympics, because up till when she wins her gold, the Americans had actually not been performing very well, and they had blamed everything from the weather. It was fairly rainy, to eating too many desserts sorry, you might hear my dog barking in the back. This is the pleasure of being at home and doing Zoom. But she was able to cancel out all the distractions and just focus on the job at hand. And so she becomes the fastest woman Olympian, the first woman, running Olympian track star. So she returns home like Gertrude Ederle as a real success story. And there's a parade thrown in her honor when she returns to Chicago. She's there with her parents. There are multiple parades. She receives all kinds of gifts. And so she immediately sets her sights on these 1932 Olympics. She was just getting started. She was interested possibly in coaching at some point. She had great athletic hopes for herself. And this is when tragedy strikes. And I should add too, that these are the types of things that I could never make up for a novel without sort of being accused of being too far-fetched. But Betty's story is remarkable. And so when I talked about digging around kind of in the historical record for some women athletes to write a novel on, Betty's story, I found it fairly quickly, and I just was amazed that no one had, that I had never heard of her, because I believe her to have actually the most amazing comeback story in American athletic history. Because what happens is she's in a plane crash. She goes up in a small biplane with her cousin, and it crashes, and she is left for dead. Her body is tossed in the back of a truck, and she is, a farmer essentially drops her off at the undertaker at the morgue, and it's not until that undertaker sees her chest moving, he realizes she's still alive. He calls doctors for her to be revived, and she's discovered to have a variety of injuries. And doctors tell her she'll be lucky to ever walk again, much less run. She needs to give up all her Olympic dreams. But Betty, fortunately, was not one to take no for an answer. And so these photos I have right here, these are from Betty's family. Her daughter and granddaughter were really lovely and were very forthcoming with information about Betty, and including photographs. This one on the left is her with a nurse in her wheelchair. And she was in a wheelchair for several months, but she really took it upon herself to start trying to walk, because she did not think she was done yet. And the device on her right, I'm still looking for information if anyone knows what kind of a PT device that is, but that was one of the things she did to kind of help recover her muscle strength. Some of the amazing details I learned from her family was that, you know, her legs, after her accident, never were the same length again. One leg was always a little longer. In fact, her family has wondered now if she would she would compete possibly in the Paralympics under today's standards, not the regular Olympics. But she has just this amazing story because she does come back and she competes in these 1936 games. But she just, she had a leg, the screws in one of her knees that they put in, like clicked her entire life. And so she just has this amazing comeback story. And so that was, I knew right then and there that this was one of my main characters. And yet, while I love this idea of a woman who, you know, starts off as kind of this America's golden girl and then has this crash and has to really kind of claw her way back to success, I wanted to show some other paths of women into the Olympics because there was a real range of experience I was finding. And so my next main character is Louise Stokes. Now, Louise was a Black girl living outside of Boston in what was a small town called Malden. She worked her way up through the New England racing scene. And then you can see in 1932, along with Tidy Pickett, Louise is there on the right, Tidy is on the left, circled. They become the first two Black women to qualify for the Olympic team. So again, this is 1932. That's one of the team photos of them. And Louise ends up having this fascinating story. A story I really call her kind of the erased Olympian because so few people have heard of her. There are very few photos still of her. She was someone who had worked her way up to this very amazing and unusual path of coming to the Olympics, like Betty, and yet she then will encounter all kinds of obstacles that I've kind of hinted at here. When we look at all these candidates, these are from mostly 32, a couple from 36, you'll see there's not a Black face in the crowd. And so what I'm kind of hinting at here are the many different types of obstacles that Louise and Tidy will run into because of the color of their skin and the era in which they're trying to compete. They'll run into all kinds of what we now call microaggressions, macroaggressions, by their teammates, by coaches, and certainly by people outside of the sporting world who were making it difficult for them to compete. What became really interesting to me about this was there isn't much on Louise. Unlike Betty, there's a biography written on her, and Helen, my third main character, as many of you know, there is a biography written on her too. But Louise, there's very little. You know, women's lives in general, especially in this era and earlier, tended to be kind of underrepresented for a variety of reasons, and many of which have to do with legal status. And Louise is a Black woman. There's even kind of less recording of her, of what she did. And so Louise offered a really interesting possibility for me to really delve into historical fiction and kind of embrace that and do some research into what life would have been like for a Black girl living in this area of New England, what her options would have been from an education standpoint, from a job standpoint, kind of what would her life have been like. I went to Malden, and you can see there on the left, there's a statue dedicated to her. It's one of the few real statues dedicated to her. However, I have an update, and I should update this deck because a couple months ago, there was a trail that actually is now dedicated to Louise Stokes in Malden. That's a new development that's just come up. And they sent me some photos of it, so I need to add those in because it is really exciting for Louise to get some recognition. So there's now the statue dedicated to her and the trail, both in Malden. And then I was able to find the railroad tracks where she trained. That's a photo of me there with, they are through a strip mall now because they were paved over. But Louise, as I said, she kind of worked her way up through this racing circuit in New England. People were very impressed by her tenacity, and she was fast. She was so fast that that's how she received, of course, her invitation to try out for the 1932 games. there's another aspect of this. So with Louise's life so undocumented, something I really struggled to understand was what would have propelled her to what she'll experience in 1932 when she goes to Los Angeles to compete in the Olympics was described as a huge disappointment by her to her family, because she'll kind of be pulled essentially from the team at the last minute. Several other white women will be kind of added to that relay pool, largely because they had coaches who were kind of acting on their behalf, advocating for them, while Louise and Tidy really did not have that. And so they'll be cut at the last minute in Los Angeles from running at the time when they should have. I was able to find their qualifying times, all the heat times they had raced in Chicago to qualify for this Olympic team, and their times were excellent. There was no reason other than both sexism, because I don't think these women were taken very seriously, and then certainly racism. Some other white women were put ahead of them into this pool. But what were really, so as I was trying to understand what would have prompted Louise to endure this huge disappointment in 1932, and then to not quit, but to continue to persevere and try for 1936, I needed to understand what would have motivated this woman. And I was really lucky because I was able to find an article from the Boston Globe in the 1970s written by a sports reporter by the name of Glenn Stout. He's in Vermont now, and I was able to track him down, and he had written this article about her, and he was very generous and sent me this huge file he had created on her, largely from visiting the Malden Public Library's microfiche collection and printing out all these articles he had found on her from the little small local paper. And he was able to build a record of her racing career. And he had talked to her family, and that's how he knew how disappointed she had been in 32. And so he told me to go ahead and copy his file and send it back to him, because he really felt like she had the story too that he wanted to see told. And so as I was struggling for a way to better understand Louise, I was trying to do some research into what just Malden would have been like during this era. And something I found was an article from 2017, actually, it came right up, that Malden had just realized that their World War I monument that had been dedicated in 1920, and has about, that's it on the left, it's the white monument there. It has about 550 names on it. Well, historians were realizing in 2017 that it was actually missing 1,500 names, really the rest of Malden's veterans. And so what they realized was it was only accounting for those 550 names, were only accounting for the Irish Americans in Malden. But it was leaving out the women who served, it was leaving out the town's blacks who had served, it was leaving out Italian Americans, it was leaving out all these other groups. And I think this is fascinating because monuments have been a big part of the news in the last few years. And so I found it fascinating how Malden chose to deal with kind of what they saw as a bit of a problem they had with one of their monuments, not being inclusive really of a wider history. And so rather than tearing down this monument, they raised $50,000 more. They did a lot of homework and realized, tracked down these 1,500 other names and built 2 more monuments to flank that original. So now the 2,000 and something names of these Black athletes are all, not just Black veterans, sorry, all different kinds of veterans from World War I are all included on these monuments. And so when I thought about these Black veterans who would have returned home to Malden and other places in the United States, for example, that provided me with kind of a tantalizing glimpse into maybe what Louise would have been feeling, because these men returned home and they had served many, obviously they had seen people die, their countrymen had died and they weren't being recognized in many ways. And yet these men continued to be great patriots. They would dress for every parade in this country. They would continue to hang their flag. They would encourage their children to get educations and be also great American citizens. Well, these veterans gave me a little insight potentially into what Louise would have been experiencing, where she would have been galvanized to keep going, to try to kind of overcome this sort of limitations that some of her countrymen were placing upon her. She would have tried to keep pushing against those and keep moving forward. And of course, now we know there's a very rich history of American Black women in women's track and field. Well, Louise and Tidy, they're all the beginning of this. And so this, why I tell you this story of the monuments and these veterans, what is that this is where historical fiction can be so interesting, because where there can be some mystery and room for interpretation, you can do research responsibly and figure out other parallels to draw in. And so it was through doing this research about the veterans and the monuments that I did create this totally fictional character in the novel, Uncle Freddie, who becomes a real advocate for Louise. And really, while she experiences doubts and isn't always sure how she should proceed, it's that Uncle Freddie character who continues to motivate her based on what he's gone through too. And so that's what I love about historical fiction. We can draw these connections thematically to try to, not only entertain, but also educate a little bit. So I like to always talk about that. And now, of course, there's our third Olympian from Missouri, Helen Stevens, who I know many of you are familiar with. The photo there on the left is with her coach, Coach Moore. And I really felt like he was such a great character for me to think about and write about, because he's a great example of what we now call, of course, in 2020, like an ally, right? He saw the potential in this young woman and he tries to propel her forward. He was getting really nothing out of it. He just could see that she was a young woman who was in need of some direction, in need of some friends, in need of maybe some purpose. Because if you know anything about Helen, you know that really her youth was spent in this rural farm area of Fulton, where she grew up with a father who doesn't support her. She was very gifted. She was fast, she was strong. And yet her father, really just wanted boys. And so in many ways, she was a disappointment to him. And so she's a real outcast in her community, whereas many of the girls would have been, planning their weddings and what their houses would look like and families. Helen, that really didn't interest her. She was smart and she was bookish and she was athletically gifted. And these weren't really things that anyone valued in a girl. And yet she persists. She goes to the high school, even though her father really wasn't in support of that. He would have preferred she had gotten a job, but she was interested in advancing her studies. She goes there, and that's when she's spotted by Coach Moore while she's playing on her church's basketball team. And he can just see that she is just so athletically gifted. And like Betty, he'll throw a time trial a few days later, and lo and behold, again, she just knocks the barn doors off of all of the records that he can see just on his little stopwatch. And so that is the beginning, not only of Helen's remarkable career as an athlete, a lifelong career as an athlete, but also what I felt was a really special relationship between this coach who wants to see this young woman succeed, and a woman who I felt was really in need of an advocate, in need of an ally. And so on the complete reverse side of this is one of the more famous photos of her from the collection at the Historical Society in Columbia, of Helen with Hitler. This is a photo that you can see, it sort of circulates on the internet about her. And this is one of those moments, of course, too, when I say there are moments in this book that are stranger than fiction, of course, where she does meet Hitler. She has him sign her autograph book. And it's something straight out of, now, of course, again, we know the Me Too movement. He will make advances at her and she will rebuff him. But these Berlin Games end up providing a setting where all three of these women, Louise, Tidy, and Betty, will all come together to compete, to represent their country in these Olympics. And it's a setting that you really can't beat, of course, because it's got everything from, this political tension and social drama, and of course, the Olympics themselves. So while I was researching Helen, I think many of you probably know Sharon Kinney Hansen. Her biographer was generous enough to invite me to Missouri, and Sharon took me around and we visited the Historical Society. I was able to see Helen's handwritten diary, hold her track shoes. That we went to Williams Wood to see. They have a great collection there with, I'd like to always point out that's a wool warm-up uniform. I mean, now we wear performance fabrics and really comfortable shoes. You can see that those track shoes, of course, were not very comfortable. And I still can't imagine wearing a wool tracksuit. But so it is amazing to see in some ways how far we've come, at least from a athletic equipment and sort of clothing standpoint, for sure. But that is when I'm always asked about what my research process is like. I always love it when I can visit a place that is important to my main characters. And so that was Missouri. I went to Chicago. I went to Malden. I went to all of these places to try to just, when I could, meet people who had known them, or and see the things that, you know, holding Helen's handwritten diary is, of course, was a great thrill, the track shoes as well. Meeting Sharon, who knew her, who was very generous with her research, and then going to places like Malden and getting to jog along those train tracks where Louise ran. That is always very exciting. On top of that, of course, I read a lot of books. There are some great nonfiction books on these women and just this era, of course. There are films, everything from Olympia, which I know you had a screening of, and you know, movies even like Race about Jesse Owens. There's a great documentary called Olympic Pride, American Prejudice, about the Black athletes who competed in 1936. So there's a real range of sources that I can visit when I am researching these women. I was helped out by multiple librarians who were wonderful and sent me, scanned old newspapers and sent them to me. Archivists, like in Thornton, Illinois, sent me Betty's old yearbook pages. So it really becomes a real team effort of all the many people who come to my aid. I don't know how people used to write historical fiction, of course, before the internet came along, because a great resource to me were all these old newspapers. Not on top of the microfiche newspapers that had been sent to me by Glenn Stout, I was able to, I am a subscriber to newspapers.com, and I really spent hours upon hours reading hundreds of old newspaper articles about all three of these athletes. And I became fascinated by how the media was representing these women and talking about these women. And I decided then that that was going to become a part of my novel. Was, you know, I read hundreds of these articles, so essentially you don't have to. And so I was able to recreate by kind of using the language that I was accumulating from all these different papers to give readers a sense of how people were talking about these athletes, like describing them as the buxom gal in lane 3 who is feisty and looking for a fight. I mean, things that now we would like to think that are ways that the media would not describe women athletes. It was fascinating for me to really see that language, and therefore I decided it was important to include it in the book. And it serves, of course, a narrative purpose where I'm able to give kind of a wider view of what was happening in society at this time with these women Olympians. Like I have an article, of course, about Stella and a few others who were sort of peripheral to these characters, including, I should point out, one Olympian who I researched from this, who is from Puyallup, Washington. She was a woman named Gertrude Wilhelmsen, and she was one of the first women, or one of the few women in this 1936 team of track and field athletes who was a mother. She had had a baby fairly recently, and her husband was very progressive for the era and told her to go off and try out in Providence for the Olympic team, and she qualified. And then, you know, he gave her his blessing for her to continue on to Berlin, and he stayed at home and took care of their young daughter. Well, once the novel came out, I was actually connected to this family, and remarkably enough, Grandma Gertrude, that's what they all called her, her family lives within walking distance of me here in Seattle. So I've been able to go down and spend a lot of time with them. And they have this remarkable collection of Grandma Gertie's things, her photos, her pins, her old baggage tags, photographs, including some that have never been published of Louise Stokes. So they have this amazing collection. And that's where just writing a book, probably putting out all kinds of creative work, can just be so exciting. You never know the adventures that will happen once you put the work out there, and the people you'll meet. And so that's been a really gratifying aspect to certainly to Fast Girls. Now, I'm often asked what were some of the big surprises as I was working on this novel. And I had no idea, I'll be totally upfront that I had no idea there had been such an active campaign to boycott the 1936 games. And it was almost successful. It was just put off by a few votes. And really studying these 1936 games were fascinating to me because I learned how much the Olympics we take for granted now, like the torch relay, how deeply rooted it was in Nazi ideology. Hitler created that relay to kind of give an example of connecting his Nazi regime with ideals of the ancient Greeks. So these Olympics were used as a real propaganda device by the Nazis, and I know there was a talk on this a couple weeks ago, but so I'll just touch on it really briefly. But it really is it's 1936 games really mark a difference in our Olympic history from kind of Olympics that were kind of disorganized before 1936. This is the beginning of really the Olympics as spectacle. And these women all got a sort of a front row seat to it. And reading the oral histories that some of these women gave was fascinating because while they were enjoying the headiness of being in this fascinating, very urban city, very cosmopolitan, they were aware in some cases of the tension that is underlying it all. And for example, one woman had described looking out her dorm window one night in their the building that the women were put in and seeing Nazi troops out sort of drilling and practicing. And she would never forget that and sort of the chills that ran through her as she saw that. So of course, that was something then I had Louise experience firsthand in the novel, because just something like that, I wanted to draw that tension between while the excitement and exhilaration many of these athletes were experiencing with the real underbelly of what was happening here and what Hitler was trying to accomplish with these games. A really interesting aspect of these 1936 Olympics that I think is really underreported are the contributions by Black athletes. We have this photo here on the left of Helen and Jesse, who became friends. And Jesse is, of course, probably the best known Olympian from these Olympics. He won 4 gold medals, and he was a real, it was such a successful athlete. Really, most Americans knew of him. And yet, out of this team of 359 American athletes who arrive in Berlin to compete, 18 of them are Black athletes. And so that photo on the right there is just a snapshot of them, not all of them. You can see Tidy Pickett is there in the middle. We have Mac Robinson, who is Jackie Robinson's older brother, a few wrestlers, and so a range there. But these 18 athletes, and really, again, I want to remind us all that really all we've probably heard of up till now is Jesse Owens. These 18 athletes go on to win 25% of the medals won by the Americans in these games. So really a disproportionate success rate with these athletes. And yet American newspapermen didn't want to report on the success of all these Black athletes. They knew they couldn't get away with not reporting on Jesse. The news about him was too big to contain, but they really then downplayed the successes of all these other athletes. And so, many of these men who won medals in Berlin returned home to the United States. They were collegiate athletes, and they couldn't compete in races throughout the United States that were in Jim Crow areas because of the color of their skin. Jesse was never allowed to live on campus at Ohio State, Dade Albritton to his roommate, excuse me. So I think that this is a fascinating part of this story that I touch on a little bit when there's some scenes where Louise and Tidy are able to meet up with these other athletes. And the men have they're a little savvier to what's going on and the pressures placed upon them, because initially the NAACP, it discourages these athletes from going. They don't want them to give Hitler sort of more of a platform with which he can, he could preach his ideas about white supremacy. And yet athletes like Jesse Owens decide they didn't want to be cowed by that. They wanted to go and compete. And not only did they want to go and compete and show that Hitler's ideas were wrong, but they knew they were also competing against the ideas within their own country. This idea that they couldn't compete in certain races, that Jessie couldn't live on campus. They wanted to prove themselves to their own countrymen. And so I think that is also a fascinating aspect of this story. And I say this partly because there's so many different directions this novel could have gone in, because there are so many fascinating accounts of trailblazing athletes. And this is a book that I get a couple of emails almost every week from family members who are looking for information about their own relatives who competed in some of these early games. Many of them have, these are women emailing me about their grandmothers who they know competed in 1928 or 32 or 36, but they just don't know anything about them. And do I know anything? And so that's been really exciting to kind of try to play a small part in having these women's stories told more. And also, another part of this, of course, is so many Jewish athletes were afraid to go to Berlin. And so a great deal of American athletes, Jewish athletes, didn't go to Berlin because of their families' concerns about sending them right into Germany. And so there is an alternative Olympics held here in the country for just Jewish American athletes. I think that would be a fascinating idea for a novel too. So you can just see right within this kind of milieu of these three Olympics that, and I view them as kind of a discrete period, because then we'll see 1940 and 44 canceled because of World War II. But there are just so many interesting avenues to follow of all of these different athletes and their stories and what they have to overcome. Because also, let's not forget, this is the Great Depression. If you've read Boys in the Boat or Louise Unbroken about Louise Zamperini, you know that a lot of these athletes had great obstacles they had to overcome. And yet very few people have known that there were women at these games. And so this has been such an amazing project for me to pursue and learn more about these women who, again, have sort of paved the way, not only for some of the women we think of as being trailblazing athletes, be it Billie Jean King or Joan Benoit, but the many women who have come later. We can all join our high school teams or go on and cheer our daughters on their school teams because of some of these early women like Betty Robinson, Louise Stokes, and Helen Stevens. So I finish off, of course, with this photo of the women's track and field team from 1936. There they are in their sweatsuits. I would like to point out those were, I don't think, well, maybe they were wool. I'm not entirely sure. But they look very bulky and uncomfortable. And I do find it amazing what, these women, they were given initially, I should say too, men's uniforms that they had to tailor to fit them. So all kinds of ways we see that these women had to overcome different obstacles to have their moment of competing in the sun. And so this is when I would love to open, I've been yammering away for about 45 minutes. I would love to, I can take any questions. I'll check the chat and see if we have, just the one still about recording, but I'm happy to answer any questions about writing process or historical fiction or any of these women in particular. Or I can keep talking. So feel free, if you have a question, to either unmute yourself or put something in the chat. And I will come up with a few more things. I'm asked why I didn't just write a novel about one of these women. Specifically, it's always Betty that people think that, her dramatic story of the plane crash. But I really did, as I mentioned a little bit earlier, I really felt it was important to follow three very different women into this path to the Olympics. Their ages are slightly different, certain races clearly different, their socioeconomic status was a little different. I thought all of this, they gave us a sense of the range of just, people thought that if you ran fast or trained hard, you would maybe develop a beard or a mustache, or your uterus could fall out. There was a great deal of concern about fertility. All of these women took great pride in disproving all of that. So thanks, Tricia, for the question about how many years did I spend researching and writing Fast Girls. I spent about 3 years. I think this started about 2017, working on this. And Initially I thought I had this great idea of working on this novel that then would come out during this Olympic summer of Tokyo 2020. The joke is on me because obviously the universe had a very different idea about what was going to come our way. So I'm hopeful that the Olympics will happen in some form, hopefully next summer or something, because I do think we're at a really interesting time in women's athletics. That's something we see. I've done a lot of book club chats, and book clubs are always love to talk about how in some ways this novel I mean, we can see progress, right? We no longer believe our uterus will fall out if we run quickly. And in some ways, really, how have things changed? I mean, we know there's the great debate within the women's soccer world about pay, and I should say that that's just the team that has been raising awareness, but women's pay in general across in athletics is very uneven. Coaching opportunities, media representation. There are so many different ways that we're at a really pivotal time in women's sports history. There's still not an equal a number of events open to women in the Olympics that there are for men. The Olympic Committee has still not met their targets in having women on their executive board. So I think that, we saw American women in particular do so well in 2016 in Rio. And I think 2020 was going to bring even a more amazing crop of women athletes to the forefront. And so I hope that these women who have been training their whole lives will get that opportunity, hopefully next summer, to really show the world what they're made of and keep pressure on all these forces that are working against giving women equal pay and more opportunities in the sporting world. Because I just think that the Olympics will give more women momentum, and I think that's really important. So aside from the tragedy of all these Olympians not getting to compete this summer, I think there are greater forces at work where it'd be really exciting to see again that momentum continued and pressure placed on sponsors for things like benefits and pay and again media representation, so that we can see more advancement and equity in the world of athletics and women. Any other questions? That was a good one. I'll also say, as far as the researching and writing, I wish I could say I just do all my research up front and then I'm done, but there's often a real toggling back and forth between, at the center of the story, I want there to be a real heartbeat of these women's emotional journeys. And in many ways, I pictured this story as kind of a relay race, a race around the track where the women are carrying that baton for their chapter and then handing it on to the next one to tell her story. And that kind of goes around and around. But I really, I'm always then having to go back and figure out some things like travel times or what people ate or what they wore and all these different details. So the research, I am constantly researching up until really, even through the copy editing process, we're sometimes double checking if language was used from that period or what certain things were called. So the research is always very much ongoing. So thank you again, Tricia, for that. And now I have a question from Susie. As a female athlete yourself, have I ever encountered any barriers? And I really have to say, no. I've been very lucky. And I think a lot of the women of my generation have been. I mean, I played field hockey. I do remember this very clearly. As a high schooler, I played field hockey as opposed to the women's soccer team. And I always felt like the women's soccer team at our school kind of took a real drubbing at the hand. The boys' soccer was always considered better and faster and more highly skilled. So the girls' soccer team really never got quite the attention they deserved because they were just as hardworking and just as talented. And I was always quite relieved to be playing field hockey because there was no male equivalent. And so maybe there would be sort of something in there of feeling very grateful that I wasn't in a sport necessarily that was aligned exactly with the men's, because there's just this attitude, I hear it still all the time, that my team here in Seattle, the Storm, just won the WNBA championship, and yet there's been very little attention paid to that. Very different from, for example, when the Seahawks won the Super Bowl. And so there is still this real perception of of women athletes not being as talented, not being as fast, as strong, all of these things. And you know, the games are equally exciting no matter what. And so that's always what I have to point out, because these are athletes, no matter what gender, who are competing at the utmost of their skill level. So to answer your question, Susie, I have been lucky. I really haven't, but I have seen it certainly with some other sports and other friends. And so thank you. That's a good question. And now I have a new one from Anita. Do you hope that your book will somehow create change that will result in greater recognition and salaries for female athletes? Oh my gosh, Anita, I mean, that would be the dream, of course. I don't know if my book, you know, will be that spark that does anything like that, but honestly, my hope is simply that this does get readers talking and thinking more about these issues. And to my point earlier of you really never know the adventure of where a book will take you. I mean, maybe someone would read this who is in a position to create some change for women, and this, I don't know if this could influence, but of course, you know, I would love it if there are more and more discussions about opportunities for women athletes. That is definitely the hope. And you know, if I can play a tiny role in being any part of that, that's an honor and something beyond even what I would hope. So thank you, Anita. That's a good one. Fingers crossed. Any other questions? These are great. Do you want to tell us anything? Oh, sure, about my next book. I just handed it in on Monday to some early readers, so I am hopeful that that will, you know, I'll get some feedback probably next week. This new book of mine is about a group of women who are known as the Angels of Bataan. And this was a group of US Army nurses during World War II. They were in the Philippines, which was considered this very exotic, wonderful post in the late 30s, early 40s. You know, many of these nurses were American women who had grown up on farms, were used to working hard, but wanted off the farm. And so they enrolled in nursing school, which was far cheaper than any sort of university education. And they, if they joined the army, they could be stationed all over the world. And Manila was considered the Pearl of the Orient, the sort of dreamiest post you could hope for. And so these women went, and then they're swept up in World War II. And they have just this remarkable story because they spend about 6 months fighting on the front lines with the men, patching the men up, enduring everything from tropical diseases and malaria to all kinds of new weaponry injuries and jungle life and all of these things. And then they're taken as prisoners of war, and they endure 3 years in a POW camp. And it's just really, and they all survive, which is really remarkable if you know anything about the difference of, you know, survival rates of the Allied forces in prison camps, Japanese prison camps during World War II. The fact that all of these women survive is just testament to how, when they were captured, they understood the importance of service, and they continued to nurse their entire time they were serving in the camps and everything, dressing every day in their falling apart uniforms, doing whatever they could to stay busy and stay focused. And so it's a great story of hope and resilience. And, you know, I mean, it's become very relevant right now with women, with nurses on the front line today, serving, of course, in the face of COVID. And you know, just as far as some historical perspective on hard times and what it takes to endure real challenges. So I've taken a lot of comfort in this book. It's shown me that Americans can do hard things. And also, it's just a crazy part of the story. I went to the Philippines in February and was really lucky to get home in time right before everything started shutting down. It was a really crazy time to be traveling, but it was an amazing research trip, and I learned so much, and it was just priceless to get to visit Corregidor, which was this fortified island the women were on for a while, and to see the jungle firsthand, and Manila and the camp in which they were taken for 3 years. So it was a really powerful trip, and thank you. And that book is currently titled, we'll see if the title stays, it's currently titled Only the Brave, and it is scheduled to be out next fall of 21. So keep your eyes peeled for that, please. Thank you. Thanks for asking me. And then Sharon, what do I have to say about Title IX and gender tests for women? You know, this is another area that the Olympics really still, their policy continues to change on intersex athletes. I think it is a fascinating topic, and this was something too while researching this book. Of course, there's everything that Helen has to overcome as a gay woman. And then there's Stella and the amazing story that lies behind her. You know, I don't know what to think. I mean, I certainly don't fall into the camp of thinking that people are trying to compete as women because they see that as a way to do better. I think that we really have to be very empathetic to intersex athletes and listen to them and really try to figure out what is the fairest path for everyone. But I certainly don't think that intersex athletes are competing because they see competing as women as an easier way to compete. And I know there's a great deal of concern about that in the athletic world. I personally think that if you have found yourself on that path, you're struggling with all kinds of issues, and you don't need you know, some of these pressures from outside forces that are just making it that much more challenging for these athletes. I think you know, these athletes are all amazing and competing at the utmost of their skill level, and I think we need to find a way to have them all competing safely and fairly. So thank you. That's a good one. And I'm watching, you know, what the Olympics continues to sort of change their policy. I'm watching with great interest because it's something that they have been contending now with for over 100 years and still really haven't figured out. So thank you. And Trisha, what book am I reading now? What book am I reading right now? I'm reading Disappearing Earth by Julia Phillips. It's a book set in Russia about two sisters who go disappearing. It was I think it was nominated for the book award. It is fascinating. It's beautifully written, and it's a great way to take my mind off of everything right now. So thank you so much for that question, Trisha. Claudia, thank you for reading the book. Can I talk a little more about my visit to Fulton? Yes. I mean, you know, these visits are always so powerful because they really, everything from my trip to the Philippines to Fulton to Malden, they really are always such a helpful way to try to better understand your character and the community in which they were growing up in. I mean, Fulton is still that small town, and it's you know, it's hard to, or no, it's helpful to imagine a young kind of Helen Stevens trying to find her way and find community in a place that didn't really know what to do with a woman who wasn't neatly fitting into conventional paths. So again, I was grateful for the help, the welcome from Sharon and taking me around, and also to visit those artifacts of Helen's firsthand in Columbia was a great honor. It's always just, I mean, I love seeing even just people's handwriting first. I mean, it's always really exciting. Everything from the fingerprints when she gets her passport, all of that is a real thrill to see. And I think really enriches, you know, my research and my writing. I love seeing all the old photographs. I know in in Sharon's program 2 weeks ago, she has some great photos in there that I highly recommend. If you missed it, go back and see her recording. And so, yeah, so these visits are always really a dream. I had never been to Missouri before I came to Fulton. So it's also just helpful to see, you know, what big sky you have there, and just kind of how the landscape is very different from, of course, what I experience here in the Puget Sound. So everything, the people, the landscape, the artifacts, the brick sidewalks in Fulton, I mean, those were charming to me. It's always just a thrill. So thank you. Okay, and now Bill, it's interesting you bring up famous tennis players. Althea Gibson is one, I've read her memoir, it's fascinating. Yeah, okay, so Bill, I'm going to tell you that actually when I started researching this book, because I still play competitive tennis, I was interested in a tennis story. And I ended up kind of becoming derailed into the fascinating lives of these women track stars. But don't count out a tennis story. I'm definitely still interested. So maybe I will be back. I spent my summers right outside of Newport, Rhode Island, and I love going to the old tennis center there and seeing their museum. So there very much could be a tennis story in my future, because it's a sport that's very near and dear to me, and it is a real sport full of trailblazing athletes. So stay tuned on that one. Thank you. And then, oh gosh, Claudia, yes, there were so many fascinating things about Helen and her life that didn't get into my book. My book ends with that relay in 1936. Helen has a life that just is getting started there. I really believe if the Olympics hadn't been canceled in 40 and 44, I'd like to think Helen would be a household name, because her athletic ability was beyond anything any of the other women were bringing at that point. And I think she was just getting started. And I'd like to believe maybe she'd be on postage stamps or something, because I think she would have been such a leader in her field for at least a decade. Unfortunately, the war, cut off that sort of path to her. And she wanted to lead a life that there was really no path for her yet in many ways to be a professional athlete. There were few opportunities for women. She is a pioneer, and she managed and owned that semi-professional basketball team. So her life is just as interesting after 36 as it is before. And so, that's where Sharon's biography comes in handy to read more about her life. It really takes on so many different themes that are still very timely to today. So I was interested in that sort of narrow window of 28 to 36 in my novel, but these women had fascinating lives beyond 36. Also, Louise ended up founding the Colored Women's Bowling League, which I think is fascinating. And so, both especially Louise and Helen were real lifelong athletes. And, Helen did so much for really getting many of her teammates to be included in various halls of fame. She was a real advocate her whole life for women's participation in athletics. So really there could be many books on her. There are all kinds of interesting aspects to Helen's life. So thank you. That's a really good question. And good, yes, of course, get Sharon's book. It's chock full of, it's an exhaustive look at her life. You'll find all kinds of wonderful details that never even made it into my novel. So have fun. And thank you for coming. And we're right at about 6:03. I don't know if there are any final questions. I'm happy to stick around for a few more minutes, or potentially you're all kind of winding down for the night. So I really want to thank all of you for tuning in again, asking great questions, sticking with me through this whole time. You can always email me through my website with any other questions. I'm on all the usual social media channels, and if you're interested in a signed book plate or anything for your book, shoot me an email, and I'm happy, and include your address, and I'm happy to send you one. And again, just thank you all. I really am grateful. It's always thrilling to talk about these wonderful women with a willing audience. I should also point out, my life before becoming an author, I was a high school teacher. And so it always is a thrill to talk, I keep using the word thrill, but to talk to people who want to learn more just because they are lifelong learners, not because they have to be at school at 8 a.m. and they're sort of stuck with me for an hour. So I'm always really grateful. And that is awesome that you got to see Althea. And that's amazing, Bill. That's very cool. I'm very jealous. And so again, just thanks to all of you. I don't get to see anyone's faces, but
thank you so much too.
Yeah, thank you.
It sounds like your research trips are just full of surprises, and it's just exciting things that you were able to find out.
Yeah, but I should point out too, it's also just as exciting to read these great books, these nonfiction books, or see these films. Really, when you are interested in history, you can be excited by all kinds of things, like finding the old newspapers with old photos. The trips are always exciting, but really it's always fascinating to find all these old things that, one thing who knew that women competed in throwing rolling pins? As I was reading old newspapers, that was one thing I discovered. That was a competitive event I've never heard of. No, I did take our rolling pin outside and threw it to measure it, just to kind of see, and it is hard. So, you learn all kinds of things while working on books like this. So,
well, Well, good evening to you, and thank you so much, Elise.
Yeah, thank you. I really appreciate it. Again, keep in touch, everyone. Thanks so much. Stay safe.
Okay, good night.
Thanks. Good night.